We'll start again with the next session, session 3, which will be chaired by Nick Jarrett. Nick, I trust you are able to introduce yourself and then do the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivo. I'll give it a go. So, I'm launching straight in, am I? Okay. So, my name's Nick Jarrett. I'm head of the Veterinary Pharmaceutical Service within the Veterinary Medicines Department and Division here at the EMA, and I've been asked to talk today on this title of Driving Collaborative Evidence Generation and Improving the Scientific Quality of Evaluations. So I've got 10 or 11 slides, and I'll run through those hopefully in about 25 minutes, which is probably a little bit more than I'm supposed to take, but that includes this introductory blurb, so that's okay. And then I'll hand over. I'm not quite ready for that. Thank you. And then I'll hand over to each of the panelists in this session and ask them for their sort of reactions, comments on the presentation. And so perhaps I'll just take the opportunity to briefly introduce the panelists at this stage already. So we have here on my right Professor Jason Weeks, who will be providing a sort of regulatory perspective. And he sits on the CVMP and is chair of its Environmental Risk Assessment Working Party. And then we have Dr. Jacques Lechenet, who is representing Animal Health Europe, and so will provide the perspective of the innovative industry. And then one seat further along, we have Dr. Elsa Vecino, who is representing the European group of generic veterinary products, and so will be providing a perspective of the generics industry. And finally, one step further along, we have Professor James Wood, who is a veterinary epidemiologist and heads up the Cambridge Vet School, and so will be providing an academic perspective. So, okay, and as I say, I'll sort of try and move through the slides reasonably quickly, and I'll have to talk a little bit quickly because I've got a fair bit of material to get through, so apologies if I seem to be rushing a little bit. But so what are we trying to get at with this title? Well, of course, we're referring to the fact that what we want as an output is we want high-quality scientific evaluations supported by high-quality reports. But in order to achieve that, of course, we have to collaborate with stakeholders. And of course, it's the applicants, the drug developers, that generate the data that the regulators need to assess. So the regulators need to be clear in expressing what their expectations are. So we need to collaborate, we need to communicate, we need to understand each other, and we need to share information and data, and to do that in appropriate ways at appropriate times. And then sticking with that theme of communication, we need also to think about communicating not only with our industrial stakeholders, but with stakeholders more generally, with the users, with the public. So we need to think about whether our existing communication tools are adequate for those purposes also. So this slide, this presentation focuses on those themes of collaborating with a view to improving or developing new approaches, and then also how to communicate those and communicate the output more effectively. So I'll run through a number of areas which are considered to, well, where these themes are thought to be particularly relevant, but as has already been highlighted earlier today, this is just a consultation, or at least the first step in a consultation. So, of course, there may be many other ideas out there, there may be better ideas, and the aim is to receive those. And when we have all of those after the consultation, then we will need to sit down and think about where to put the efforts in order to actually move these various aspects forward. So, okay, if I could have the first slide, I'll try to be quicker with these. So this is a list of what we've called our core recommendations. Well, really, they're just the areas in which these themes of collaboration, communication, and development of approaches are thought to have particular relevance. So we've got the environmental risk assessment, and of course, in recent years, we've seen greater emphasis being placed on that. and there are developments ongoing there that we need to remain abreast of. The second point there relates to safety of residues, so consumer safety. Of course, consumer safety is always an area where stakeholders have particular interest, and in fact, it's an area where in recent years we've seen some divergence of practices between different risk assessment bodies. Then we've got pharmacovigilance, which is, of course, a theme on which the new veterinary regulation has a fair bit to say. So we can be fairly confident that we'll see quite a lot of activity in that area in coming months and years. And then there's a slide on communication generally, and finally a couple of slides relating to benefit risk. And here we're asking that question of whether the existing approaches for assessing benefits and risks are up to the task of dealing with the sorts of data and the sorts of products that we may be seeing in the future. So next slide, please. So then, looking at each of those in turn, I'll just run through a number of more specific topics where the general themes that I've described are thought to have to be particularly relevant. So in relation to environmental risk, the first bullet here talks about novel approaches. So it's asking whether the existing framework is sufficiently sufficiently flexible for dealing with the sorts of products that we will be seeing in the future. And it makes reference particularly to the feasibility of establishing active substance monographs, which is, of course, in line with the new veterinary regulation, which indicates that the Commission will need to produce a report on that topic. And we would imagine that we would feed into that process. The second bullet here also links back to the new veterinary regulation and the use of PBT substances. So the regulation indicates that PBT substances, at least in food-producing animals, should only be used when there is some particular justification based on health needs. So should we be looking at whether or not there's a need to further outline what those sorts of justifications might be. Then the third bullet point brings up aquaculture. So aquaculture is a growing area and an area in which there are relatively few authorized products, which leads, of course, to the increasing likelihood of use under the cascade, for which an environmental risk assessment will not have been performed. It's also important to note that some of the substances that are relevant may also be being used in other sectors as biocides or pesticides. And so there is a need then to communicate with other organizations that are involved in regulating those sorts of products, because it makes little sense to have risk mitigation measures established for veterinary medicines that then just don't tie in with the sorts of uses and measures that are in place in relation to other sectors. And then the final bullet on this slide focuses on research, and so relates to the idea that perhaps we should be more involved in trying to drive the research agenda, trying to input into funding decisions than we are currently. So, okay, next slide, please. So sticking with environmental risk assessment, so the first couple of bullets here also relate to the bigger picture, to the fact that the environmental risk assessment, or in the environment generally, is very much a One Health area, and that, as I said, there are other sectors in which similar types of substances are used, and there's a need to interact with the relevant bodies in order to make sure that the approaches tie in together. And then the final bullet point relates to capacity building. As has already been mentioned, environmental risk is an area in which there is a growing emphasis, and it mentions specifically combination products. So here we're thinking about perhaps mixture effects and also sort of novel product types, and whether or not the existing framework is able to deal with those sorts of issues and products. Next slide, please. So then we move into the safety of residues area. And here the first bullet point relates to biological substances. So we're all quite used to thinking about the MRL process in relation to chemicals, and we know that immunologicals are exempt from the requirements for MRLs, but what about biological substances that are not immunologicals? How are we supposed to deal with them? So questions are, does the current MRL framework, do the tests that are typically used have any usefulness in relation to biological substances? Is it even possible to monitor biological substances in food? So there are a number of questions there. Then the second bullet relates to harmonization. As I mentioned previously, there are some divergences in relation to the approaches being taken. Even within Europe, EFSA uses a quite different model in relation to its intake assessment than the model used by CVMP. And we've seen in recent years, Jacques has been moving away from the use of its standard food basket. And of course, given the global nature of industry and trade, there are potentially great benefits to be had from harmonization. Then a bullet on modeling, simulation, and extrapolation. So we heard a little bit about these kind of issues in relation to 3Rs previously. And we have seen in recent years in a couple of MRL applications the use of physiologically based pharmacokinetic modeling creeping in. And do we have the capacity to deal with these sorts of approaches if we're going to see them more often in the future? And then a last bullet on this slide, which parallels the one that we had for environmental risk, focusing on trying to become more involved in driving the research agenda and inputting into funding decisions there. So next slide, please. So then the first bullet here, this is still on the theme of safety of residues, relates to combination products. So we're often told that as consumers, as people, we're exposed routinely to cocktails of chemicals, but that's not something that we address in our MRL evaluations. Is it something that should be looked at more? The second bullet relates to exposure to the same substance but from different sources. So we had a parallel in relation to the environmental risk. So we may have exposure from pesticides as well as from vet meds, and the current approach is relatively crude. We assume that 55% of the diet is made up of plant material, so we allow use of 55% of the ADI for pesticide MRLs, and 45% of the diet is made up of animal-based foods, and so we allow 45% of the ADI for vet med MRLs. But is that really a sufficiently robust approach for considering dual use? Then we have a bullet on data sharing, linking in, of course, with the 3Rs, which we've already heard about, and should we be thinking about ways in which data sharing could be increased with a view to decreasing animal use? And finally, a bullet on communication generally. So we have our standard, tried and tested communication vehicles. In the case of MRLs, there's particularly the European Public MRL Assessment Reports, but are those really the documents that the public are likely to access? And should we be doing more to disseminate our reports and evaluations? Okay, so next slide, please. So then we come to the theme of pharmacovigilance. And as already said, this is a theme where the new veterinary regulation has particular relevance. And the first bullet point there just relates to the need to involve stakeholders as much as possible. And of course, communication is absolutely key in relation to making pharmacovigilance work. The second bullet relates to the use of sales and use data with a view to optimizing the incidence statistics that we get and the rates that we can produce. And this is perhaps particularly relevant in relation to rare adverse events where it's difficult to distinguish between an adverse event and a background sort of level of occurrence anyway. And the final bullet on this slide again relates to communication, and so we know that obviously the public is interested in adverse reports and adverse events, and when they suspect one, where do they turn to get information? They're perhaps not likely to turn to these sort of official documents and to the regulatory reports, but rather they'll turn to an internet search, and which may bring up the official documents, but maybe not in the first few hits. So should we be looking at ways to communicate more effectively with the general public? So next slide, please. And then the first bullet here ties in with the new veterinary regulation and the need to develop systems for signal detection methodology. And the second bullet also ties in with the new veterinary regulation because we know that there are specialist vets that have a lot of knowledge about actual safety and efficacy profiles, and that information may not make it back to the regulators. So how could that knowledge be accessed, and possibly by setting up stakeholder groups with relevant practitioners in order to gather that? And then the final bullet point on this slide again relates to communication, but not communication with the general public, rather the communication of users and facilitating the way that they can feed back on adverse events. So use of technology there, mobile phone apps and so on. Next slide, please. So this slide just addresses communication generally, and I think most of the topics have actually already been touched upon one way or another. It just, again, to highlight the message that we're looking to ensure that the communication is disseminated appropriately, and that it is robust, and that we have the relevant data required for it. The final bullet on this slide again links in with the final bullet on the previous slide, actually, and the idea of using new communication tools to gather pharmacovigilance data. Next slide, please. So this slide relates to the benefit risk assessment. And as already mentioned, the question here is whether or not the existing approaches for assessing benefits and risks is able to deal with high-tech science. And the example given in the first bullet relates to exquisitely sensitive methods that could indicate the presence of an extraneous agent, but without additional information in relation to whether that agent is able to replicate, whether it's present at biologically significant levels. What are we supposed to do with that information? So how can we accommodate that? How can we deal with that sort of data? And the second bullet relates to novel products and products that are perhaps aimed at managing the health of herds rather than the health of individuals. So we may be talking about products that manage fertility, or perhaps products that stimulate innate immunity, things that may be difficult to monitor at the individual animal level. And do the existing approaches allow do they allow assessment of that and conclusions on those kind of areas? I mean, we could receive applications for these kind of products at the moment, and they have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, but should there be a more established framework? And then the final bullet on this slide relates to non-conventional sources of data, and we've already talked about some. So we've got increased use of modeling. Somebody mentioned big data previously. should we be looking at ways to understand and to these sorts of data more and to learn how to use them. And next slide, please. So this is the final slide on the benefit risk. And the first bullet there relates again to new product types and types of products that, although administered to animals, may be focused on trying to safeguard the health of humans. So perhaps products for zoonotic diseases or products that would reduce the production of allergens in animals and so reduce allergic reactions in humans. And then the last bullet of the presentation really just comes back to the overall theme, highlighting that what we want is high-quality assessments supported by high-quality reports and disseminated in appropriate and effective ways. So that's the last slide, I think. Can I just okay? This is the final slide with the panel members. So at this stage, then I'll hand over to the individual panelists and ask them for any reactions or comments that they may have. So perhaps I'll start with you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I don't actually have a PowerPoint, but I do have a set of scribbled notes, so I will use those. From an environment, and I'm going to comment particularly on the environmental aspects of that presentation. I have to agree with everything that you've presented, Nick. That I think there's nothing there that I disagree with. There's nothing there that I would necessarily challenge. I think my issue is the level of aspiration and ambition that we have. And I think that if you think about technology and how advanced in technology are really rapid. Just the example of smartphones. Smartphones were introduced less than 10 years ago, and look where we are now. So I think the need for the regulatory demand in the ability to keep up pace with the technology is really important. And I will say that if you look at the solutions for the environmental issues that we're currently facing, and perhaps some of the solutions going forward for some of the issues around perhaps PBT use in veterinary medicine, the innovation and the solutions are there. It's just how we build that into the flexibility within the system. So for me, it's about the flexibility and fluidity of the regulatory framework to be more accepting and more tolerant of those technologies going forward. So I think that there are methodologies that are not consistent with the current risk mitigation measures that we could start to think about how they're introduced into that framework to mitigate some of those concerns. I think there's a real need for greater consistency of policies on a global basis. So the EU is not in isolation, unlike certain countries within the EU at the moment. So I think there's a Brexit reference, that's terrible. I think there's a real need to harmonise on a global approach in terms of where we are and what we ought to be doing, and looking at the FDA. And I know that happens, but it doesn't necessarily happen on an environmental front. I think it's really important that we consider that some of the barriers to some of the recent assessments have been around the environmental consequences. If we take the DNA vaccine in salmon, for example, one of the key barriers there was actually understanding the consequences of the release of that material into the environment and the likelihood for interaction with wild salmon. So there are new challenges that are coming, and we don't quite necessarily have those tools as yet in terms of how we deal with these aspects. So I think there are challenges going forward, without a doubt. I think we need to have that flexibility and fluidity to deal with those. And I will close on, we spoke a little bit about pharmacovigilance. I think there's a real desire and a need to include eco-pharmacovigilance and look at what those signals are and how we deal with those signals when we actually see them, and how we mitigate that going forward. And just, my scribbles are from the process so far. There was a comment this morning about more risk assessment and less hazard assessment. Now, as a risk assessor, I'd start with the hazard assessment and then work through the process to either mitigate or remove that hazard through the risk process. So I don't differentiate that. To me, the risk assessment is a process of understanding the likely hazard. So I don't discriminate those 2 points. And just a point of clarity there. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm not sure that I'm really supposed to react to your reactions, particularly, Jason, and we'll open it to the floor afterwards, and maybe we'll get some more general comments. So perhaps we'll just move along the line, if we may, Jacques.
So thank you. Just there's a slide, please. One slide. Thank you. So just that it was a lot of different topics on this on the slide and that has been discussed. We have chosen also to base the comment on what we do like, on what has been said and approach. For that, taking some bullet points there and making some comments, because there is always something coming with a good idea. It's a bad implementation. So then we do like the science-based and modernized regulatory approaches with improved collaboration with all stakeholders, all meaning truly all of us, with an important to keep a balance between the availability of the medicines, the new one as well, and the even more detailed data requirement that you can get or need or want for scientific interest mainly, and not anymore for the assessment of the product. The new technologies will also give us tremendous amount of data. We need to be sure that's useful to the assessment. We fully support the improved and regular communication from the agency to the public to be sure that they understand the benefit and the safety of the authorized new product as well as new technology for them to better accept this, but also to include why we, all of us, believe when the medicines are authorized that there is a good decision-making behind, so we have the appropriate rationale published and make available. We, as has been said, recognize the importance of the international dimension of developing new approaches. You need to be sure that it's accepted worldwide, otherwise you just do twice the same, or you deal with twice the same topics, but not with the same data or the same approach, risking different conclusions. So it has to be, as you said, work on a global basis to be sure it's largely approved and accepted. And we do like this international approach. We have very strong support for global harmonized new pharmacovigilance system. It has been said that part of reducing the administrative burden by the EU Commission. And we like this risk-based approach, not a regular PSUR, have a modern approach with a signal detection. Still, be sure that when you implement this new concept, you are not going into too much of the administrative report of what is easily doable because it's a new approach, where we can have still time to dig in where we need to dig in those data. Improve regulatory science, which should be science-informed, and that like this step 2 that Ivo mentioned earlier. We should base our development on the science and inform. You will not have all the data, but do we need all the data? It's not sure. And we need to move away from this worst-case scenario and be more to what is the true risk-benefit of the assessment. That's true for new, but also for existing product, because we still need the existing product and existing technologies before having only the new one. And for this one, I will take an example in vaccine, because there are more in the vaccine guide. That, for example, the risk for the emerging disease, the risk of not having a vaccine when the disease will hit the EU was not recognized as a risk. You don't have a need today because there is no disease. So you have to have a lot of data to show the benefit of something which is not needed. Nowadays, after a few of the outbreaks that has been mentioned this morning, in the previous session, you see that not preparing ourselves today for what comes next is a big risk. And it should be taken into account with the benefit of what you show as a data. So that's something new, because not a classical approach of what the risk is. It is also in the future. And finally, I have a risk assessment tailored kind of answer to your remark, because we may agree or disagree, but we need to avoid confusion between hazard assessment and the risk assessment, because if you have a very hazardous materials that never exposed to anyone, there is no risk. And this is the exposure, it is not the substance. So it's a mix of both, and we have to have a systematic approach and not confuse both of them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jacques. Again, I think we'll just move along to the next panelist, and then open for a general discussion. So, Elsa.
thank you for the invitation to ECBP to this session, which is looking into harnessing some large scientific data sets coming from the various sources, being ecotox data, pharmacovigilance data. And we try to go to the point, what is more of concern for the genetic veterinary industry is that the development of genetics is currently being prevented by the ecotox data requirements. This is not of surprise. Today, the full area has to be required for a genetic application, which is a major constraint for our industry in the decision-making of the product development. So there is a question mark if this was indeed good regulatory science, and if all these huge efforts did bring us any further forward, because we have generated enormous sets of data, but besides being nonsense and in contradiction with the generic principle, the industry has been suffering from unpredictability, and the studies have been required again and again for the same substances, with a consequence of divergent results and divergent consequences also, and decision-making in the product for the same molecule. So yes, indeed, we would be happy to explore in the long term to make a system which is more efficient, which makes a more efficient use of resources for both the applicants and the authorities, while ensuring a better environmental protection, which is the final objective. So we are certainly in favor of exploring the viability of a workable system in the way of monographs or ERA master files, whatever, which could allow, on the one hand, making a meaningful use of existing data and making encouraging companies to join efforts to generate new data. That's the principle, and I think that's a nice principle. And this could be a good solution to support new and viable generic applications. But through some internal brainstorming and also discussion with regulators, we understand that implementing any system would not be that easy. There are important limiting factors. As an industry, it's mainly around the competition issues and intellectual property rights of the data owners and the access to the data. So that's a critical point. This is of high concern for both originators and genetics, I believe. There is a lot of data generated already, and how this could be accessed, it's a critical point. So yes, let's think about it for the long term. The provisions are there in the legislation to think for a feasibility of whatever system we can think about. But we still think that whatever is envisaged requires a huge involvement of the competent authorities. So do not leave us alone with consortiums and things like that, because it should be coordinated. We have some ideas to be discussed maybe at a later stage. In the meantime, where we see there is more of an urgency, besides the issue of the potential monographs or long-term solutions, is that we still see there is not enough predictability, unfortunately, in the current regulation of veterinary medicines. It is quite unfortunate that this regulation is not clear enough with the requirements, in particular for the circumstances where the data will be required for generics. There are several articles that complement each other but contradict, but there are many requirements, and in the end we have tried to get clarification with the European Commission, but we have been told, well, indeed, further guidance is needed. So we really need it, because if the requirements pop up during the procedure, this is very harmful. And we would like to know, before a dossier is submitted, what are we really expected in the field of ecotoxicity. Just two very quick comments in terms of pharmacovigilance. The first comment I received is that, yes, for the establishment of expert groups, to access the actual use data. That's very much welcome, and it's a very good recommendation. But it should be noted as a point of attention that the off-label use is generally rarely reported to marketing authorization holders unless adverse events are present. So just as a point of attention. And secondly, there are some recommendations to move forward with new technologies, apps for the phones, for reporting and so on. And I don't think there is much concern with that, but the comment is that before moving into that, probably we should look into a more simple reporting format into the database to make something which is really simple as ordering goods on the internet, and that where the vets and the users shouldn't spend more than 20 minutes to report, because we understand there's still some time limitations and burdens with that. The last and general consideration is regards the points on communication channels, which are regarded indeed as a positive evolution, as this can increase the understanding from the public, but the extent should be carefully considered in order not to damage the business interest. Other than that, we thank the EMA for all the recommendations. We think that on any other aspect of the presentation are very appropriate. We also thank the EMA and the committees for the quality and of the scientific evaluations, and we look forward to provide more detailed comments during the consultation procedure. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Elsa. And then Professor James Wood.
Yeah, so James Wood from Cambridge University, and I want to talk to you as someone who is principally a veterinary research scientist, but I want to talk to you about some of the opportunities and some of the educational opportunities that exist in this broad field of working with European educators of veterinarians. And I'm going to give you some personal reactions. So I think that there's often a focus in terms of dealing with adverse event reporting on technical solutions. And I think in our veterinary community, there is also the need for a cultural change, certainly in many of the parts of the profession, not just those with off-label usage, but there is a lack of cultural, social imperative for veterinarians to report adverse events. And I think that we can do much more, and you can work with the schools to improve the rates of reporting, because I think this is primarily an educational issue, and we have to start with the young people because it's easier to change them. But I think the technical solutions can make this much easier, but they're not enough on their own. I want to talk a little bit about One Health issues. We're still at a very crude stage with what we regard as One Health. And one person's One Health is often very different to another person's One Health. And often we forget the environment in the discussions. And it's great to see environment and environmental risk assessments so firmly embedded in what has just been discussed. But I think the point about environmental risk assessments, and in particular in relation to antimicrobial and AMR, is that the underpinning science around this is very weak. We have very, very little idea of what the impact of environmental contamination with antimicrobials is, be that with the primary product, with the product that's excreted in unchanged form, or with active residues being excreted by species that have either intentionally or inadvertently been treated with the product. And I think that this may be an area where there's whatever we feel about the need for clarity, this is an area that societal pressures will probably change this and the needs of this to a very great extent. I think that for universities to work better with you, broadly the pharmaceutical industry, you can help us with capacity building and education. And I think that there is a willingness to work with you across many veterinary educational university organizations more than we currently do. And I think that if there's any way of working through the various educational associations, of which all of the current European schools will still be members of the European associations even after the end of March, That's my not a joke, but it's a very clear commitment, and I think that we can work things better. And one area where I think academic work can help improve the risk assessments that are currently undergone relates to something as simple as looking at quantifying antimicrobial drug usage. At the moment, we have a very poor understanding and very, although there's a lot of work that's been done to try and improve the standardization and harmonization of reporting, I think we can do much more to understand proper drug usage, whether it's per animal, per kilogram of meat produced, in a way that currently is lacking. And I think that we can do a lot to build on what Nancy said earlier in relation to quantifying the risks of usage of drugs in animals by harmonizing our approach to usage. I would caution, however, statements about the small risks from use in animals, because these risks need to be looked at on a global basis. And if you look at the global usage where people in many parts of the world outside of Europe and the developed world live very closely with their animals, there is far greater risk of transmission of organisms from animals to humans in different environments that we are not so familiar with here in this type of setting. I think that there is a lot more that can be done, and there can be greater academic greater benefits coming from collaborations with scientists, be they in relation to evaluation of risks of finding small amounts of DNA either in the environment or in any other tissue. And one of the things that I'd like to pick up on in later sessions is the I think very underused use of modelling to evaluate the benefits, in particular of biologicals, but preventive measures in preventing infectious diseases. It is impossible on a scale that is affordable to evaluate the benefits of a vaccine in preventing epidemic disease, because the major benefits will come from reduction in transmission, which we are more or less unable to measure experimentally in a way that is affordable on the scales needed. And I think that modelling based on very high quality data has been used in a small number of efficacy claims that have come through this agency, one that I've been involved in. There's far greater scope for doing that, and I'd encourage the use of this type of approach, because actually what we really should care about is, does the vaccine stop this disease from transmitting? That is for epidemic disease, that is the most important thing. And actually, at the moment, most of our evaluations don't even consider the most important question. And that is a challenge for you, the regulator, to take into account the real need for that the market has in this area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're probably running a little bit behind time, but nevertheless, I think we can open the floor for a few questions, Igor.
Yeah, may I suggest that we open the floor for questions until 5:30, and then we continue to the next session. So that gives us about 8 minutes to do that.
Okay, approximately 8 minutes. So who would like to come in? Okay, Dr. Jungbeck.
Thank you. Yeah, what bothers me, and I will continue with the discussion on the definition of One Health. And my problem as a vet is always that vets and veterinary products are only looked at to support human health. But in principle, the first important thing is to have healthy animals, and then automatically the human health is positively impacted by that. And we should not reduce the definition of One Health to human health, where the vets serve only for the human health and where the research only focus on zoonosis. For this is definitely a too restricted approach.
Okay, thank you very much. Any further comments? Ivo.
Yeah, I've got a question for Professor Woods, actually. I like the idea of looking at vaccine efficacy in a different way and looking at transmission and also bringing in modeling. I think we have to look at modeling for a different number of topics in regulatory science. But then I'm also concerned, on the other hand, that it would place an additional burden on the applicants to provide us with additional data or to do it in a totally different way. So it can only be done if we can use that modeling to replace something else, which we're currently requesting. And there's always this difficult balance of when do you decide, for example, if we can get rid of the field trials requirement and replace that with modeling, and that can generate the same sort of data set on protection in the field and on transmission, then that would be a real benefit. But modeling relies very much on the quality of the input data. So where are you going to get the input data from? So can you briefly reflect on that? And because I think it would be an excellent topic for a regulatory science project where we and academia could work together and look for funding and say, okay, what are the prospects of having more modeling on board in that?
If there was an easy answer to that question, you wouldn't have answered it because it's because it wouldn't have been necessary. And I think that some of the best quality data for diseases that maybe this is not true for new and emerging diseases for which we have very little underpinning knowledge, but for many diseases, the data we need to parameterize our models in a way that it makes them meaningful already exists and is in the published literature based on experiments. The simple things that you need relate to the period between infection and infectiousness and how long infectiousness works and so on. And much of that information is already there. The data on transmission has to come from observations of natural transmission. And that can be done experimentally. And in many cases, it can come with carefully designed observations of natural epidemics, which in many cases for diseases where there's enough economic basis to develop a vaccine, it should be possible to deliver that. So I wouldn't like to suggest that it's easy, but I think that it is an area where through collaboration, greater progress could be made in a way that would allow this exchange of one cost for another, as you suggest. But if the answers were there already, then we wouldn't be having the discussion.
Could I briefly comment on that?
Yes, please.
If I may. So, Jeroen Kortekaas, I'm a representative of the ZAPI project. And in the ZAPI project, one of the things we are focusing on are neutralizing antibodies. And there's a good reason for that. The viruses we focus on can be controlled by neutralizing antibodies. And if we isolate neutralizing antibodies from animals and we can show that the antigens that we produce bind to these neutralizing antibodies, then we could theoretically at least do without at least some of the animal trials. So for certain diseases, I think you can do almost without any animal trials, and this is the objective of the ZAPI.
May I complete?
Please.
I'd like to complete what Jeroen said and what was discussed before in one of the slides, is that we put animal welfare as a European principle. We're doing as a regular work, because of the regulatory constraint, we are, I would say, killing a lot of animals, probably not very usefully. We know it, because we are stuck by pharmacopoeia, which, by the way, should be modernized, please, because really there are some monographs of a pharmacopoeia are really out of date, and we know it's very difficult because it's not EU, it's bigger. And we are, all of us, and there is a project now in Europe to work for surrogates. I use the word with very big caution of efficacy. And you know, in human, they don't do challenges. So in most of the case for vaccines, again, I'm a vaccine guy, sorry for that, they are looking at all evidence of efficacy with markers. And of course, they are looking at vaccine effectiveness either through field trials, but even after, because the pharmacovigilance and other systems are in place. And we talked a lot about looking at the human example. I think what we could do along the road, not now, I'm afraid, is that if we are bringing scientific evidence that there are surrogates of efficacy, like Jérôme mentioned, but there are also the cell-mediated immunity, which has bad reputation, but the tools have improved tremendously. So we ought to look back at that. In the veterinary world, we are so happy with our little challenges. We don't look left and right sometime, again, because of the regulation. And I think that maybe some SPCs and claims could be established through these surrogates, especially on established diseases where science is established, or even not established, but making all the precaution in the SPC so the veterinarians would know how the claim was built, and then through the signal system, efficacy pharmacovigilance, when it will work, and hopefully should and will, we know in some instances it doesn't work very well, but we should be optimistic that it will work. We could have a better view on this and not delay launch of vaccine because we are blocked by our ethical committees because it's becoming more and more difficult to get challenges done in some places, or because we don't know how to handle efficacy.
Okay, I think we're probably running out of our 8 minutes. Thank you very much for that comment. Okay, in the 30 seconds, I would just maybe summarize a couple of the things that I've heard then in the last few minutes. So generally on the theme of collaboration and communication, there was a lot of support for that. A word of caution in relation to, well, or at least a plea to be aware of business interests when publishing information. On the theme of environmental risk assessments, there was a call for flexibility and again collaboration. The point was made that it is a major concern, an area of major concern for the generics industry. And in that relation, there was interest in the potential of a monograph type system. Also calls for predictability. And then in relation to the antimicrobial resistance in the environment, the point was made that there's a lot of research still needed on that theme. On pharmacovigilance, again, support for focusing on the international dimension. But also an appeal to look at simple approaches and not to get too carried away with complex projects. And the point was also made that that the problem of under-reporting may not be solvable with technology alone, but it's an issue of education and bringing that in early. And then finally on the benefit-risk theme, the point was made that, well, in general, the One Health agenda is still at an early phase. The point was made that the One Health concept shouldn't focus solely as a sort of final aim on human health. Great interest in modeling generally in various areas. The point was made that risks have to include this potential of not being prepared for disease outbreak, and finally there was an appeal to try and move away from the use of worst case assumptions always. I think those were the notes that I scribbled anyway.